Hi friends, it's my story. The story does not begin in grandeur but in simplicity. A modest home in Cedar Park, Texas, where the walls carry decades of quiet resilience, and the air is thick with the scent of sawdust, brewed coffee, and unspoken sacrifices. James Anderson, a man whose boots still remember the weight of concrete and steel, lived his life in deliberate understatement. It wasn't that he couldn't afford luxury, he chose not to display it. His greatest achievements were not in what people could see, but in what he had carefully hidden from the eyes of a world obsessed with appearances. Because James didn't want his daughter to grow up entitled. He wanted her to earn her place in the world without ever knowing she had been born into an empire. The day Brandon Miller walked through his front door, that empire trembled not from fear, but from the arrogance that had come to test its silent strength. James felt it immediately, the chill of quiet judgment. Brandon's gaze swept the living room the way an appraiser looks at damaged goods. His eyes lingered on the worn armchair where James had fallen asleep countless nights after working late. The family photographs on the shelf, James in construction gear, hands covered in dust, seemed almost to offend him. It wasn't spoken aloud, but James could feel what Brandon saw. A man past his prime, a relic of a blue-collar world that, in Brandon's mind, held no seat at the tables of power. James had met many men like him in his lifetime, men who worshipped status more than substance, who measured worth not by the weight of a man's integrity but by the shine of his cufflinks. But this was different. This man wasn't just evaluating him. He was evaluating the bloodline he sought to marry into. And slowly, over the following months, the condescension that began as a whisper became a relentless echo through every interaction. Brandon never insulted him openly at first. He cloaked his disdain in compliments, the kind that cut beneath the surface. Manual labor is so noble, he'd say with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, as though James had survived some unfortunate condition. Or, it must be rewarding, building things with your hands. You must feel so connected to the earth. He said it the way one speaks to a child showing off a drawing. Sarah noticed it, but she did not understand it. She had grown up enveloped in Brandon's charm, blinded by his expensive suits and polished speeches. Whenever her father entered the room, Brandon found subtle ways to reduce him. When James spoke about fixing something around the house, Brandon would crack a joke about blue-collar solutions. When James talked about the duplex rentals, a humble description for what was, in truth, a massive real estate network, Brandon would steer the conversation away, dismissing it as side work. Over time, Sarah, influenced by the environment Brandon created, began unconsciously mirroring his discomfort. "Dad, maybe wear something a bit more modern to dinner tonight," she'd suggest. "Brandon's colleagues are coming. They're different from us." Different. That word lingered like smoke in James's mind. But James said nothing. Not because he was weak. Not because he didn't see what was happening. But because Margaret, his late wife, the woman whose vision helped build their fortune, had once made him promise, "Let Sarah live a normal life. Let her stand on her own. Our wealth is not her identity." So he hid it. He drove an old truck. He shopped at ordinary places. He allowed her future husband to believe he was just a common man who had done common things. But common men don't own 38 office towers in downtown Austin. Brandon's arrogance was not born overnight. It grew slowly, carefully nurtured by his own belief that he stood a step above everyone else. And as his confidence in his superiority solidified, so did his carelessness. At their engagement dinner, in front of 200 guests, Brandon raised a glass and turned James into his prop. "Marrying into a working-class family keeps me grounded," he declared, smiling as though he had bestowed some great honor. The applause stung less than the look on Sarah's face. Confused, embarrassed, almost apologetic on behalf of her father. James stood there, silent, every muscle in his body fighting the urge to end this charade right then and there. In his wallet was a business card that could have changed everything. In his office drawer were property deeds worth more than Brandon would make in 5 lifetimes. In the vault downtown was a Forbes magazine that called him one of the quiet titans of real estate. But James kept his silence. Why? Because his daughter's happiness was more important than his pride. Because a father's love is sometimes measured by what he holds back, not by what he gives. But something changed in the following months. Brandon's condescension evolved into dominance. At dinners, he would interrupt James mid-sentence to explain basic economic principles, as though speaking to a slow child. At social gatherings, he introduced James not by name, but by occupation. This is Sarah's dad. He used to work construction. Not James. Not Mr. Anderson. Just a label. Even Sarah began repeating it. Not out of malice. Out of conditioning. That was the moment James realized the cost of his silence. It was no longer protecting his daughter. It was enabling the erosion of her identity. Brandon wasn't just undermining James, he was reshaping how Sarah saw herself, how she believed others saw her. And slowly, painfully, James witnessed his daughter begin to shrink in rooms where she should have stood tall. The night before the wedding, James sat alone in his quiet home, staring at a photograph of his late wife. The moonlight washed over Margaret's smiling face. He remembered her words when she was dying. If anyone ever disrespects our family, don't let them mistake your silence for worthlessness. James closed his eyes and made the decision that would alter the course of every life involved. His silence had been an act of love. But tomorrow his voice would become an act of justice. Because humility is a virtue, but when used against you, it becomes a weapon. And some weapons must be answered. The ballroom shimmered with golden light, crystal chandeliers casting reflections across tables adorned with white roses and expensive linen. Guests moved through the space with champagne flutes and polished smiles, unaware that beneath this celebration, a storm was gathering, silent, calculated, inevitable. To everyone present, Brandon Miller was the rising star of finance, the charismatic groom who had married a woman from humble roots. He played his role with the precision of a seasoned performer, shaking hands, introducing Sarah with an affectionate arm around her waist, and reminding everyone at every turn just how far she had come to reach him. "She keeps me grounded," he would say, as if her existence were a charity he had taken on. "It's beautiful, really, how love transcends status." The crowd would nod, enchanted by his confidence, never once looking toward the quiet man standing at the edge of the room. James Anderson, the father who had funded every inch of this wedding yet remained a footnote in his own daughter's story. Every introduction was a performance. My wife, Sarah, brilliant, driven, made it out of a working-class home. Sarah comes from a simple background, but that's what makes her strong. He painted himself as the savior, Sarah as the rescued, and James as an example of what he had generously overlooked. Each sentence he spoke was dipped in admiration, yet sharpened with contempt. And through it all, James remained silent, his expression unreadable, his hands calmly folded behind his back. But the silence was not weakness, it was anticipation. Across the room, Brandon gathered his colleagues near the champagne fountain, their suits tailored, their laughter sharp. James approached with his briefcase at his side, each step deliberate. Brandon spotted him, and his smile shifted, tightening, becoming the smile of a man preparing to perform superiority in front of an audience. "Dad," Sarah said softly, appearing at James's elbow. "Brandon's just talking business. Maybe we can do this later." Later. A lifetime of later. James simply nodded. Brandon's voice carried through the group. "We're discussing a $400 million acquisition. Very technical. Might be a bit over your head." One of his colleagues snickered. James looked at Brandon with calm curiosity. "What's the cap rate?" The shift was immediate. Brandon blinked. "Excuse me?" "Capitalization rate," James replied. "Net operating income divided by property value." Basic real estate math. The younger analyst's eyebrows rose. Brandon forced a laugh. Oh, you know about cap rates? That's impressive. James continued. Class A buildings? Downtown core? Or are you buying B-tier properties? The air changed. One of the men stepped forward slightly, intrigued. Brandon's jaw tensed. Mostly Class A, he muttered, voice strained. James nodded thoughtfully. Makes sense. Downtown Austin cap rate at 6.2%. Solid choice. That was the moment Brandon's confidence wavered. The precision of the number, the complete alignment with reality. It wasn't a guess. It was knowledge. Detailed knowledge that no ordinary construction worker should possess. The circle fell silent. James reached into his briefcase and pulled out a white business card. You might want to look into the Anderson Properties portfolio. Brandon took it with a smirk that quickly dissolved as his eyes locked on the lettering. James Anderson, CEO, Anderson Properties LLC. His face drained of color. Patricia Wells, managing director at Morgan Stanley, stepped closer. Mr. Anderson, Anderson Properties. James nodded. We've been trying to get a meeting with you for 6 months, she said slowly. Brandon's hand shook as he looked back at the card. Each second dragged long, heavy with realization. But you're a construction worker, Brandon stammered. James met his gaze. I was. Then I started buying what I built. Silence fell like ice over the group. Within moments, the truth began spreading through whispers in the ballroom. Eyes turned. The man who had been dismissed as a simple laborer was now being spoken of as a real estate titan. Brandon's breathing quickened, but pride is a stubborn disease. Instead of stepping back, he grasped the microphone. And then, in front of 180 wedding guests, Brandon made the gravest mistake of his life. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, unsteady yet determined. I think it's time we speak honestly tonight. Sarah's face paled. James remained perfectly still. We all know weddings bring out big emotions. And sometimes people with insecurities say things to feel important. The crowd shifted uneasily. Jim Anderson is a good man, Brandon said, gesturing dismissively. But he's not who he claims to be tonight. He's not a real estate mogul. He's just a retired construction worker with stories. A few nervous chuckles flickered, and then silence. James stood. The weight of the moment pressed down on every heart in the room. Brandon stepped aside, expecting retreat. Instead, James placed his briefcase onto the podium and opened it. What followed was not an outburst. It was a revelation. One by one, he laid out property deeds. 38 buildings. Total value $1.4 billion. He held up the lease agreement for Morgan Stanley's downtown office space, signed by Brandon himself as tenant manager. Gasps rippled through the room like a storm wind through glass. You were right, Brandon, James said quietly. We should know our place. Your place is in my building, paying me rent every month. The champagne glass slipped from Brandon's hand and shattered on the ballroom floor. In that moment, the entire narrative, the one Brandon had so carefully crafted, crumbled. The room that once echoed with admiration for him now stared in stunned disbelief. Faces turned. Conversations halted. Even the air seemed to pause. But this was only the end of the beginning. Brandon's humiliation would not be contained to that single night. It would stretch over the next 72 hours and dismantle everything he had built, every illusion he had sold, every lie he had believed about power. Because power isn't what you show to the world. Power is what you keep hidden, until the moment it must be revealed. The silence that followed the champagne glass shattering was unlike any silence the ballroom had ever known. It was not stillness, it was judgment. It was the moment before lightning hits the earth, the second breath held before an entire world changes. Brandon stood frozen, surrounded by the weight of his own undoing, while James Anderson, the man he had mocked, diminished, and humiliated, remained calm, composed, and terrifyingly certain. But humiliation alone was not the end. It was merely the ignition. Brandon's ego, rather than collapsing, rebelled. Shame hardened into rage. His pride, cracked and bleeding, reached for denial like a drowning man reaching for air. He staggered forward and snatched the microphone again. "This is fake," he screamed, voice slurring as the alcohol took full control. "You think you can just walk in here and play billionaire? These documents mean nothing. He's lying. This is all some twisted stunt." There were people in the room who had wanted to believe him, but they had already seen too much. Patricia Wells, calm, composed, a woman whose entire career depended on accuracy and truth, rose from her table and walked forward with slow, certain steps. Without a word, she reached into her clutch, pulled out her phone, and dialed a number. She held the phone to the microphone so the entire room could hear. 2 rings. Then a voice. "Anderson Properties, 24-hour emergency line. This is Jennifer." Patricia's voice was steady. "Jennifer, this is Patricia Wells from Morgan Stanley. I am here with Mr. Anderson. Could you confirm his identity?" "Yes, ma'am," Jennifer replied without hesitation. "Mr. James Anderson is the founder and CEO of Anderson Properties. Would you like me to read his bio?" Patricia handed the phone to James. He nodded once. Jennifer continued, her voice echoing through the ballroom. "Mr. Anderson founded Anderson Properties in 1987, owns 38 office buildings in downtown Austin, over $1.4 billion current appraised value, generates $190 million in annual rental income." Every word was a blade, slicing the illusion Brandon had draped over every guest in that ballroom. Brandon's lips trembled. This is a setup," he muttered, stepping back. "It doesn't matter. You can't prove." James opened his briefcase one final time and drew out a manila envelope as if he were unveiling a verdict. "Brandon Miller," he said, voice low yet cutting through the air like thunder. "You were given every opportunity to show humility tonight. Instead, you chose arrogance." He held up the first document. "This is a notice of lease termination for your office at 221 West 6th Street. A ripple of gasps tore through the room. Patricia stepped forward, eyes wide. "Mr. Anderson." He held up a hand. "The lease allows termination within 90 days for breach of tenant conduct standards. Brandon Miller's behavior tonight qualifies. Morgan Stanley will be given an opportunity to relocate. Brandon will not." Brandon lunged forward. "You can't do this." James pulled out the second document. "This is a complaint to Morgan Stanley's HR department, detailing your conduct tonight toward a major client." Patricia took the document without hesitation. Then James revealed the third. "This is a letter to the Texas Department of Banking. A formal request to review your license based on your public behavior, intoxication, and breach of fiduciary conduct." The ballroom was silent. The entire atmosphere had shifted. Brandon, who had once stood on the highest pedestal in the room, now stood on collapsing ground. And James, still composed, still calm, was merely stating facts. "You didn't know who I was," James said quietly, "because you never cared to know. You saw what you wanted to see. A man with rough hands. A man who worked with his body instead of his ego." He stepped closer. "And because you assumed respect was yours by birthright, you never learned how to earn it." Brandon's knees buckled. He collapsed into a chair, eyes hollow, face drained of all pretense. Patricia turned to him coldly. "Brandon Miller, effective immediately, your future with Morgan Stanley is under review. You will be escorted from our offices Monday morning." Gasps erupted, followed by whispers that rolled through the ballroom like an earthquake. Brandon looked at Sarah, pleading silently, desperately. But Sarah was not the woman who had walked into this ballroom. She stood taller now. The fog that had once clouded her had cleared. Her husband had stripped her father's dignity and revealed his own absence of it. She stepped away from him, In the next 72 hours, consequences would unfold with brutal efficiency. Hour 12 Monday morning. Morgan Stanley held an emergency board call. Within an hour, Brandon's employment was suspended, his email access revoked, his name wiped from their website. Hour 24, the article. The Austin Business Journal ran a headline, "Financier removed after public incident with billionaire real estate titan." They didn't need to use his name. Everyone knew. Hour 48, license review. The Texas Department of Banking issued a statement. Brandon Miller's license was under immediate ethical review. Hour 72, silence. Brandon sat alone in his empty apartment, staring at his phone. No calls came. No allies remained. His co-workers had distanced themselves. Recruiters who once chased him now avoided him. The power he once wielded had evaporated, revealing what James had known from the beginning. Men like Brandon don't build power. They borrow it. And when the lender calls in the debt, they are left with nothing. In his moment of downfall, Brandon had time to reflect. But reflection is a gift granted only to those willing to confront truth. Brandon wasn't ready. He was shattered, but not changed, which meant the story was far from over. The storm had passed, but what remained was not silence. It was clarity. The next weeks were not defined by rage or triumph, but by truth unfolding in its purest, most undeniable form. The truth about dignity, the truth about legacy, the truth about what it really means to win. Brandon Miller vanished from social circles almost overnight. There were no more tailored suits, no more extravagant speeches, no more eyes turning toward him with admiration. Now, when his name was spoken, it carried a different weight, a cautionary tale of arrogance cloaked in charm. The world that once applauded him now treated him with the cold indifference reserved for those who confuse status with worth. But this was not a story about Brandon's end. It was a story about Sarah's awakening. She returned to the home where she'd been raised, not as a woman defeated, but as a woman reborn. For days she barely spoke, processing each moment from the wedding night, each memory of her husband's subtle manipulations that she once mistook for care, each moment where she allowed someone else to define her identity. One evening, she sat beside her father on the porch where her childhood had unfolded. The Texas sky stretched before them, streaked orange and purple, the same sky that had watched her grow, fall, and now rise again. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. James did not answer immediately. He simply looked toward the horizon, his voice quiet when it finally came. "Because your mother and I didn't build this for admiration. We built it for you, for your future. And a future you don't earn is a prison disguised as privilege." Sarah nodded slowly. Tears gathered in her eyes. But these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of recognition. For the first time, she saw her father clearly, not as the quiet man in the background, but as the architect of a life built on integrity and foresight. And she saw herself, not as the woman rescued by a wealthy husband, but as the daughter of strength, discipline, and legacy. Within a week, she filed for divorce. Brandon fought, but the world no longer fought with him. Attorneys withdrew. His claims evaporated under the weight of documented truth. Every accusation he made was met with a contradiction signed in his own hand. In the mediation room, when he demanded half of Sarah's family business, the mediator looked at him with thinly veiled disbelief. "Mr. Miller," he said gently, "the assets belong solely to Mr. Anderson. Your wife holds no ownership, no stake, no financial interest. You married into no empire. You attempted to stand on a mountain you did not build." Brandon left that room with nothing. Not wealth, not status, not Sarah. And in the quiet that followed, something deeper happened. Something that no public spectacle could deliver. Sarah remembered who she was. Not the woman Brandon introduced to his colleagues. Not the charity case. Not the girl from a simple family. She transformed. Dell Technologies extended her a promotion with equity, a move that had nothing to do with her husband, and everything to do with her own reputation, her performance, her value. She bought her own home. She started mentoring young women in finance. She began speaking at events, once in the shadow of a man's ego, now in the light of her own merit. And James, he watched, quietly, proudly, the way he always had. His name began to surface in places he had intentionally avoided for decades. Business journals called him the master of silent power. University boards invited him to speak on leadership and generational legacy. While others used wealth to display dominance, he used it to protect dignity. That was his true empire. Then came the moment no one saw coming, the second wedding. It was smaller, understated, a reflection of everything the first one was not. No gold chandeliers. No staged speeches about background and status. Just 80 people who loved Sarah for who she was, not what she represented. Her new husband, David Wilson, stood at the altar. A man unthreatened by strength, unintimidated by legacy. When he toasted, he did not boast or compare. He simply said, "I am honored to join this family, not because of what they have, but because of who they are." James felt something he had not felt in years. Not victory, not revenge, peace. The real culmination of his journey wasn't Brandon's downfall. It was Sarah's liberation. The empire he built wasn't a fortress of wealth. It was a shield of identity. A legacy that empowered those who came after him to stand tall, free from shame, free from doubt, free from the chains of others' opinions. In the end, Brandon became a footnote, a necessary catalyst, a loud echo that forced truth out of hiding. But James Anderson, he became a symbol, not of wealth, not of revenge, but of quiet power, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be known. Because the greatest revenge is not in destruction. The greatest revenge is standing so firmly in your worth that no one's ignorance can move you. And the greatest legacy is not in what you leave behind, but in who stands stronger because you were there. Years passed, and the night of the wedding became a story whispered across boardrooms and business schools alike. It was no longer spoken of as gossip, but as a defining moment in the study of human character, a reminder that the most dangerous mistake a person can make is confusing modesty with insignificance. James Anderson never celebrated Brandon's downfall. He never needed to. For men like him, victory is not measured in the defeat of others, but in the strength of what they have built and preserved. The world continued to call him a mystery, a quiet titan, the invisible billionaire. James just called himself a builder. That was always enough. Sarah flourished not because she inherited power, but because she earned it. She became a force of her own, helping immigrant-founded companies grow, mentoring entrepreneurs who, like her father, began with nothing but grit and belief. Every time someone called her the daughter of James Anderson, she smiled and said, "Yes, and I am also the woman he raised me to become." Equal parts legacy and self-made. David stood by her not as a replacement for what she lost, but as a partner who amplified what she already was. On their anniversary each year, he didn't gift her diamonds or dresses. He gifted her time, presence, and quiet celebration of the life they were building. One not rooted in appearances, but in truth. As for James, he returned often to the porch where everything began. The wood beneath his feet had been replaced many times over the years, but the land, the air, the silence, it was the same. Here, he did not think of skyscrapers, board meetings, or wealth rankings. He thought of Margaret, of the promise they made, to build a fortune without ever letting it own them. And he had kept that promise. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hill country horizon, Sarah sat beside him. The wind was gentle, carrying the sound of cicadas across the air. Neither spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. In that silence was an entire language. Finally, Sarah turned to him and asked, "Do you ever think about him?" James didn't need clarification. They both knew who she meant. He nodded once. Sometimes. Do you regret what happened? She asked. James took a breath, eyes fixed on the horizon. I don't regret revealing the truth, he said. But I don't celebrate his destruction either. I didn't end Brandon Miller's life. He ended his own, and I simply stopped protecting him from the consequences. Sarah was silent, absorbing the weight of those words. So what was this really about? She asked. James looked at his daughter, the woman who stood stronger now than ever before. He saw in her the reflection of Margaret's strength and his own resolve. And he said, it was never about revenge. It was about restoration. Brandon tried to rewrite your story, tried to make you ashamed of where you came from. I didn't destroy him to prove my power. I revealed the truth to remind you of yours. Tears glistened in Sarah's eyes as she reached over and took her father's hand. The sun dipped behind the hills, and the first stars appeared, silent, distant, eternal. In their light, the story found its final truth. Respect is not given. It is earned. Power is not shown. It is known. And legacy is not what you leave behind. It is what you build within others. Brandon had believed that silence meant weakness. But James had shown that silence, when chosen, not forced, is the loudest thunder of all. Because true strength doesn't shout. It waits. And when the moment is right, speaks once, and the world never forgets.